my channel. My name is Louisa. If you're new, don't forget to subscribe, and if you're coming back, welcome back. Today I wanted to look at a very popular concept of Christians and Christianity, that Christians are very repressed and don't enjoy the same liberties and freedoms as other people. On the surface, this might seem like a pretty simple thing to talk about, but it's actually a lot more complex than that. Not least of which because there are so many different versions of Christianity out there, and it can be difficult for people to figure out what is true Christianity, what was it that the original church was founded on, what did Jesus teach, what did people actually believe, and what is the various different interpretations that have come out over time. In other words, what is fact and what is fiction? There are many different religions around the world, not just Christianity, which are termed high demand religions or high control religions. And I would say that true Christianity is not a high control religion, because we're going to get into what the definition of that actually is and what to look out for. According to psychotherapynetworking.org, the definition is: a high-demand, high-control religion is a faith community that requires obedience, discourages members from questioning its rules, principles, and practices, expects subservience and loyalty, discourages trusting relationships outside the group, perpetuates the notion that those within the group are right and superior to those outside of it, promotes extreme or polarizing beliefs, and expects its members to suppress their authentic selves in exchange for the sense of belonging and security the group offers. As you can imagine, many cult-like groups fit into this category, not just Christian groups and not just religious groups. There are many different types of groups and organizations which use these methods of controlling group members, and you can get all sorts of cult-like groups in politics, in dieting, even to some degree like pop culture groups. These groups are not actually concerned about what is true, and they're not concerned about the welfare of their group members. They're concerned with having control. In many instances, they will also be trying to mine the group for resources and kind of exploit people in many different respects. And if you're dealing with a cult of personality, sometimes the main resource that they're trying to mine from people is just narcissistic supply. Jesus was extremely critical of religious figures like this, and his famous roast in Matthew 23 says, "They bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do to be seen by men. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so, you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." As you can see, Jesus used very strong language to condemn this kind of practice. Instead, his version of religion was for individual people to build their own personal relationship with God, and in so doing to improve the way that they behaved, to heal their own inner wounds and the things that they were struggling with, and to ultimately do better. In particular, Jesus sought to ease people's burdens, not overburden them. "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." There were many different ways that the religious leaders of his time tried to control people and sort of micromanage everyone's lives to the nth degree, and basically just look down on everyone around them from a lofty position of perfection, supposedly. And Jesus butted heads with these religious leaders on a constant basis, including over things like the Sabbath laws. Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And the Pharisee said to him, "Look, Why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" But Jesus said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him. And he said to them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath." As you can see from that passage, there might be laws in place which God has ordained as a general thing, but that doesn't mean that there are no exceptions to those rules. When it comes to matters of life and death, human safety and well-being, those take priority. So when Jesus was asked about which rules actually matter and which rules are more flexible and maybe less important, this was pretty much his answer. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. Then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him and saying, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." And in Romans chapter 13, the Apostle Paul expands upon this principle to explain it to church members. "Owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet, and if there is any other commandment, are all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law." So Jesus wasn't just a devout Jew who was very wise. He stated that he was the fulfillment of the law and the prophecies, that there were many requirements of the law, such as sacrifices, which would no longer be necessary because Jesus had made his sacrifice. And so forgiveness could be more readily available without having to perform all of these rituals. And in John chapter 8, Jesus specifically talks about setting people free. Then Jesus said to those Jews who believed him, "If you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed. Then you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." They answered him, "We are Abraham's descendants and have never been in bondage to anyone. How can you say you will be made free?" Jesus answered them, "Most assuredly I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin, and a slave does not abide in the house forever, but a son abides forever. Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed." So what did Jesus come to set people free of? Well, he came to set people free from sin. He talks about how sin is a form of bondage, and being forgiven and being set free means that people are able to follow rules, which kind of sounds like a very strange form of freedom. So in Matthew chapter 7, he says this, "Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. Because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it." And this is where we come to the really difficult question of what is freedom, and how do we actually exercise liberty in a way which is sustainable. A lot of people think of freedom and liberty as just being able to do whatever you want, whenever you want it, without any form of consequence or limitations. And that could be considered one form of freedom. But another form of freedom is having parameters and boundaries which form certain constraints, but within those constraints is complete liberty. The philosopher Isaiah Berlin proposed the theory of negative liberty and positive liberty. In 1958, Berlin defined positive liberty as freedom within the presence of constraints and boundaries, while negative liberty was the absence of constraints and boundaries upon a person's freedoms. Constraints and boundaries might be present in the form of laws or consequences, or they might be self-imposed. For example, there's no laws against eating only ice cream for every meal, but most of us have self-imposed limits in that regard, because we are aware of the natural consequences for such liberty. Examples: feeling sick, throwing up, or developing diabetes. Berlin thought that these two types of liberties were both possible, but I would argue that there is only positive liberty, the existence of constraints and at some point down the line, and the illusion of negative liberty. So instead, I would call it sustainable liberty and unsustainable liberty. Sustainable freedom is knowing what the constraints are, knowing what the consequences are to your actions, and exercising liberty within those constraints. Unsustainable freedom is when you fail to recognize those constraints or fail to recognize those limitations and exercise freedom without any form of constraint whatsoever, and then eventually hit a wall. If we go back to the ice cream analogy, there's no laws against it. You can do whatever you want in terms of ice cream eating, but at some point, natural consequences will kick in. For example, developing diabetes. Failing to recognize that that is a potential consequence of exercising a liberty which you technically have is unsustainable. Whereas if you recognize that there are those constraints there and there are potential repercussions for your actions, you could potentially enjoy ice cream indefinitely in moderation. However, if you enjoy it in excess without any self-imposed limitations, then eventually you get to a point where you can no longer eat ice cream because it will either make you very, very ill or you will die. So in one scenario, you are able to perpetually exercise the liberty, but in the other scenario, it's unsustainable because you do it too much and then hit a wall. Of course, life isn't always so black and white, and there can be some exceptions to the rules and some nuance, but generally this principle kind of plays out. For example, speeding while driving. You might be able to do that for a very long time without getting caught or without having any kind of accident. But there will come situations, if you do it habitually, where you do get caught. You might lose your license or you might crash. Then there are kind of social aspects to things. Like, for example, someone who always prioritizes their job over their family, and then 20 years later, they discover that their kids don't really spend time with them. Or the serial dater, people like Leonardo DiCaprio who kind of go for very young women and then dump them when they get to an age where they can start thinking rationally. Because he's now older, he's not as able to attract people as he once was, and everyone has kind of noticed the pattern. And so it's questionable as to whether he can keep doing that, or keep doing that without looking completely seedy and gross. And then there comes the question of what happens to people like that when they get older. Do they end up alone? Do they end up in relationships where the other person is essentially only there for their money? There's nothing illegal about what he does. There's nothing technically wrong with it by social standards these days, but that doesn't mean that it's a liberty that he can perpetually operate in without any kind of limitation. We have so many liberties to do things that are really bad for us and bad for our relationships, and the consequences are not immediately obvious. But over time and with accumulation, then you start to see the problems. If we go back to Jesus's statement about the broad path and the wide gate, and the narrow gate and the straight path. Many people see the straight and narrow as too confining, too infringing upon their liberties, and the broad and wide way is much more appealing. But as Jesus said, the broad and wide way leads to destruction. It's unsustainable. Whereas the straight and narrow path doesn't have a bad ending. One of them looks like a lot of freedom of choice, and the other one looks too restrictive for most people. But the thing that we have to ask ourselves is, where do they lead? If we are able to recognize boundaries and recognize natural constraints and consequences for our actions, then we can make better choices for ourselves and healthier, more sustainable choices for our future. It shouldn't mean being in a thoroughly repressed, controlling, and high demand environment, because this is an individual journey. This is between you and God. Obviously, if someone is doing something completely unethical, then they need to deal with the consequences immediately. And some churches take the notion of grace way too far and fail to report things to the proper authorities. The truth is that us experiencing the consequences of our actions is good for us. It helps us to recognize that there are limitations to what we should actually do. And in that respect, experiencing consequences can actually lead people to God, or at least lead them to not be so awful, maybe. There is plenty of freedom to be found in Christ, and it's the sort of freedom which is sustainable and which is good for you. But it's sustainable and it's good for you because it recognizes boundaries, limitations, constraints, and consequences. These are all things that everyone has to deal with in life as they progress, and it's something that we all have to think about. So let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I will see you next time. God bless, take care, bye.